Greetings. My name is Brennan Breed. I teach Old Testament here at Columbia Theological Seminary, and I am very pleased to be your guide through the Old Testament over the next few weeks. What you see on the screen right now is the Great Isaiah Scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I love to show this when we start talking about the Bible because it shows us how very different the Bible was to people in the ancient world. This is a scroll that was in existence at the time of Jesus. This is the kind of thing that he might have read from in, say, Luke 4 when he reads in the synagogue. And he pulls out the Isaiah scroll and reads it. It was something like this. This is animal skin. It's parchment. It's sewn together. You can see in the right-hand side of the open part of the scroll, there's a big line there that's stitching. They had to stitch together this animal skin. They wrote with crushed up minerals and so on that they made ink out of. It was a different time and different place. It obviously was written in Hebrew. This is only one of what we might call the biblical books right here on a scroll. That technology was quite different than a codex, that is a bound book that you and I use today when we talk about books. Also, the Bible was not bound all together as 66 small books all bound together in a translation. This was all written in Hebrew, and every scroll was different. That is, every what we might call a book of the Bible was kept in a different scroll, and was kept in jars with other scrolls that were biblical and some that were not. Some things that we don't recognize as biblical today were kept together in the groupings of sacred literature of ancient Israel. The reason I show you this is to show you how very different that world was that the Bible came from. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today in this orienting lecture to the Old Testament. I'm just going to try to introduce a couple of ideas, but also a couple of pieces of history and geography and culture to try to give us a solid footing when we think about the ancient world and the Bible as really an artifact that tells us about the encounter between God and some very particular people from the ancient world. And if we want to hear their witness very carefully as we can, then we have to take into account who they were, what world they lived in. Well, speaking of worlds, I'll introduce this, really it's a metaphor. It's a way of categorizing our questions and thoughts and comments about the Bible. There's a French philosopher from the 20th century, Paul Ricoeur, who came up with this idea of thinking about texts, and really you can apply this to any kind of artifact. He said everything that people make, an artifact, has really three worlds that are a part of it. So think of the Bible. You can open up the Bible and look at it really as something like a window onto a world of the past. So it tells us something about the ancient world. It's a record of ancient culture. It's a record of ancient stories. It's got ancient ways of speaking and thinking. We can ask questions about who wrote it, and when did they write it, and why did they write it, and with what language did they write it, and what did it look like when they first wrote it? Did anyone add anything to it later? Those are all questions that might correspond to what we call the world behind the text. That is, there's a world, the world of the authors, of the people who came up with this text. And if you looked at a painting like this, you might look at a Van Gogh painting and think, well, what did he eat for breakfast that day? What was his life story? What was going on in the world when he painted this painting, and so on? Those are all world behind the text questions. Those are great questions that we'll spend a lot of time, especially over the next week, asking. But then also there are other kinds of questions that we can ask about the biblical text. Like, for example, we can ask about the world in the text. That is, we can look at the biblical text and say, we're going to set aside questions of who wrote this and when and why exactly right now. We're just going to look at it as almost like a work of art in and of itself. What does the text say? What does the text do? What does it encourage us to do? So we might look at the Bible as poetry or as literature, right? We might think about Moses not just as a historical character. Did Moses exist or not? And if so, okay, what's the archaeological proof for it? We might lay aside those questions for a moment and say, what does Moses in the text do and say? What kind of a character is he? What does he look like? What kind of theology do we think that is the character Moses in the text, is encouraging us to have? So those are kind of world in the text questions. If we looked at a Van Gogh painting, we wouldn't think of it necessarily as only exclusively a window to the life of Van Gogh, to his own cultural context. You might also say, well, what is a painting doing? Even if you don't know who Van Gogh is, what does it make you think of? What does it make you feel? What does it look like to you? So we can study the biblical text in this way too. There's a third world of I'd say every text, but to the biblical text, we'll be thinking of it in this way. And that's the world in front of the text, thinking of the text not as just a window to the past or as a work of art in itself, but also as a mirror. That is, it reflects something to us, back to us. It's asking us to look at ourselves and our own world. And this is where I put a lot of theological or devotional questions and concerns and interests that we might have when we bring to the Bible. So we might ask about the archaeology or history of Moses. We might also ask about the literary character of Moses in the text. We might also ask, so what? What does this have to do with me and my world? So I'd say those are world in front of the text questions. So you can see, I think all three of these dimensions of the biblical text and of the way we study it are fascinating and interesting and also important. And actually, we can get in theology from all of them. So you'll come into contact with these three different worlds of the text in this class, and I encourage you to seek out the resources that you see listed in Moodle. A lot of them are purely resources for your own benefit. They're not required for the course, but they're there to help you. So you can see some of them correspond to these different kind of worlds of the text. So I've got a sermon, say, from Walter Brueggemann that deals mostly with the world in front of the text, that is, with the Psalms and how we read them and think about them. And then we also have a talk from a biblical scholar about biblical poetry as poetry. That's a literary or world in the text kind of concern. And then we have some lectures about the ancient world, the ancient context of the Bible. And that's the world behind the text. So all of those things are represented in resources on this Moodle site, in which you'll find this presentation as well. So just to give you a sense of how I read the Bible and my basic background, you don't have to agree with this by any means, but this is just perhaps helpful, a way that I read the Bible, a way that I orient myself to listening for the witness of God, the witness about God, coming from an ancient folk. So my basic theological principle is that God is incarnational. That is, God appears to different people and speaks and communicates with different people in different times and different places in the language and culture in which they speak. That's part of the incarnation, that God takes on flesh and human culture, human speech, and so on. John Calvin, the famous Reformed theologian, said that this is condescension. That is, that God allows God's self to be smooshed into language in ways that actually kind of bend theology in ways that may not be actually helpful. That is, John Calvin said, I can't use my human language to express the truths about God in ways that just utterly simplistically and perfectly replicate the truth of God. That is, human language is a human product, and it's bent and warped and has its own problems. And so that means that if we're going to try to talk about God, we have to use the language that we already know, but it's impossible for us to use this really incomplete human tool to be able to express the truths of God. But we have to. That's the only way we can talk to each other, right? It's the only way that we can communicate. And it's the only way that God can really communicate with us. In the same way that Jesus accepted the human limitations of time and space. And, I mean, Jesus had to go to the bathroom. Jesus had human emotions. Jesus had all the limitations and problems of humanity, but also that was the way that Jesus could communicate with us and get us to understand God. So, in that same way, if God spoke to people in the ancient Near East, that is, Israelite people thousands of years ago, and I want to understand their record of that encounter, which is the Bible, then I'm going to have to try to listen as carefully as I can to how these ancient folks spoke and thought and taught and the cultural context in which they lived, because that will help me to discern the core elements of their message. And also it'll help me to realize when they say something that's a metaphor that they use, that we don't use anymore, it'll help me to understand what they mean. So God is an incarnational God. If God's going to speak to people in times and places, God's going to do it in ways that they can understand, which means that God is going to speak in their language. There is a book, a fantastic book that we assign typically here in Old Testament classes at Columbia Seminary called Hidden Riches. It's written by Christopher Hayes, who's a professor at Fuller Seminary. And the whole book is just comparing biblical literature to ancient Near Eastern literature, the whole point of which is that ancient Israel's they are ancient Eastern folk. That is, they live in a cultural context that is broader than just Israel. They speak languages that are similar to the languages of other much more powerful and culture-producing nations around them, like the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians. And we know for a fact that the ancient Israelites read and considered and thought about and knew everything from the cultural history that is stories like Gilgamesh to the religious culture of the ancient Near East. And we can compare the religious and theological and literary productions of ancient Israel, that is what we have in the Bible. We can compare that with the similar things from the ancient Near East. And it helps us to see similarities but also differences. So one big difference, for example, is in sacrifice. You may have wondered, why is it that ancient Israelites sacrifice animals? Kind of a strange thing, right? We don't do that anymore in Christian churches. So some people have said, well, it's just kind of the old, stupid Jewish practice that Christians got to pass by or something like that. Well, I'd actually say it a much different way, and I say it, I think, in a much less anti-Semitic way. That is, Christians need to watch out for the ways that we speak about the Old Testament as a repository of Jewish tradition. As Paul says in Romans 9 through 11, we Christians are grafted into the Jewish tradition, so we don't throw it away. We revere it. And a big part of this is animal sacrifice. So instead of just thinking, well, we got to pass by that stupid barbaric tradition because we're Christians, instead we might listen very carefully to what's happening in the institution of animal sacrifice. So, for example, in every ancient Eastern people that we know, every ancient Eastern culture that we know of, all the way from Egypt to Persia to the Mesopotamian cultures like Sumeria, Assyria, Babylon, all those folk sacrifice animals. It's common in the ancient Near East. If God is an incarnational God and God speaks to the Israelite people in ways that they can understand, then God's going to use stuff that they understand, which means God's going to talk to them in ways like through animal sacrifice. It's not because God loves animal sacrifice that animal sacrifice exists in ancient Israel. It's because everyone sacrifices animals, and Israel gets that. They understand that from their cultural context. But there are also differences we can see from animal sacrifice practices in ancient Babylon, for example, that they're all about getting rid of demons. That is, people blamed demons for a lot of the problems in the ancient world, and the blood of animals was thought to be a ritual cleanser that cleanses the demons and gets rid of them. That is, kicks them out of your space. In ancient Israel, if you read the book of Leviticus, they talk a lot about blood and animals. What they don't talk about very much at all is evil spirits. In fact, the blood of animals doesn't cleanse the people of evil spirits. It cleanses them of their own sins. Do you see how the cultural context of ancient Israel and its environs can help us to understand what's being said to them through the practice of animal sacrifice? That is, it's a way of telling Israel, yes, God helps you to get rid of things that harm you. But God isn't as much interested in the powers of evil that might be overtaking you and assailing you as God is about what's inside your own heart. That's really of utmost concern to God. And God's most interested in taking care of that and of naming that as a source of the problems that we see in the world, at least to an extent. So it's about human responsibility and so on. That's one theological nugget you can get from comparing these things. That book, Hidden Riches, talks about that issue of sacrifice, but also lots of different things. And page 8, Christopher Hayes has this little quote that I love. He says, "No text exists in a disembodied ahistorical form. Every text comes from somewhere. Every text is written in a certain language at a certain time by a certain people to a certain audience. Time and place and language all shed light on how a text functions. Language determines who can read it. Time and place shed light on the culture and the people who produced it." That is, if we look at the ancient world, we can see somewhat better what ancient Israel was trying to say. Let me give you one example of this. This is an image of Nippur, a city in Babylonia, an ancient city. In the year 597 BCE, you'll read about this in the coming weeks, the southern kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of which Jerusalem was the capital, was destroyed by the Babylonian armies. And a lot of the elite of Jerusalem was taken into exile. Now, it's 10 years later in 587 that all of Jerusalem was really destroyed, and the temple itself was destroyed. So there are two destructions of Jerusalem. We're not exactly sure about the extent of the first destruction, but it may have just been minor. But in any event, in 597, a large chunk of the elite of Jerusalem were taken into exile. Among these was Ezekiel. And Ezekiel was taken to this town here, Nippur, which is in modern-day Iraq, next to the Euphrates River. And when they were settled there, that is, the Jews were not put in prison camps in the exile, they were just settled near major cities. They were probably processed through the city in a triumphal procession to show how great the Babylonian military was. And you can see that gate there that they probably went through. And when Ezekiel was walking through that gate in the year 597 BCE, he was closer in time to us now, that is, you and me, in the 21st century. He was closer to us at this moment now than he was to the people who founded that city. That is, ancient Babylon, Mesopotamia, Assyria, Sumeria, and across on the other side of what to them seemed the other side of the world, Egypt. Those were ancient places. The world was ancient by the time Jerusalem was destroyed as a nation. But the other amazing thing is that they had only been a nation for less than 500 years. When Ezekiel walked through the doors of Nippur, it was already a 3,000-year-old city. And Israel had only been a people for 500 years. The point of this is to say that Israel was a latecomer on the scene. They appear at what felt to them like a late date in the history of the world. Ancient Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt were already rich and deep and complex cultures by the time Israel even emerged. And by the time Israel felt like it had been destroyed as a nation, those cultures were still going strong. Israel was a minor player among great powers of the world. Now, I'm not saying that to try to make Israel seem small and insignificant. I don't need to do that because God says that a whole bunch. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, God is telling Moses and the people of Israel that God didn't choose them because they were strong or smart or powerful or the most ancient of people or the most worthy of people. God chose them because God loves them. In other places in Deuteronomy, many other places in Deuteronomy, God says, I chose you because you were slaves. That is, God didn't choose the strongest and fastest and oldest of cultures. God chose a fairly young upstart and one that actually didn't even last that long as an independent nation. The whole purpose being, I guess, that God wasn't after global domination or cultural domination even. God was trying to speak into the world in different ways. And the Old Testament, I believe at least, is a record of that kind of encounter and speech. It's the way that God tried to communicate it to the world. So that's why we're going to spend some time with the world behind the text. By the way, this picture here that you can see on the screen now, this is a cherub. Yeah, that's right. Cherubs are not tiny, fat, happy babies. They are hybrid animals. They are lion-bodied, winged, human-headed creatures. We know that because we find these things all over the place, and they're often called cherubs. This one in particular is from Neo-Assyria, that is the place in Mesopotamia. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this looks entirely normal to an ancient Israelite. They understood this image. If you don't, that means we have a little bit of learning to do about the ancient world and what it means. So ancient Israelites were closer to Babylonians and Egyptians in terms of their culture than they are to us. That is, at least I'm speaking from the perspective of an American in the 21st century. So there's a lot of things that we can overview. I won't actually go through all of these right now, but here's some things, some different categories that might be really great for us to think about during our next few weeks together. Geography and chronology, I'll start with that. I'll give you a little bit of that. Political structures. What kinds of political structures are normal in the ancient world? And they're not the same ones that we have today. Economy and culture. How do people buy and sell things? What's considered normal in terms of a job or a thing to do? How do people relate to each other in terms of their culture? What kinds of stories they like to tell? What kinds of songs do they like to sing? What kinds of what constitutes free time? That's another big question. Family structures. How do people organize their families? How do they account for who's in or out of a family? And then lastly, religion. This big category that we'll get to over the next few weeks. What do people think about God in the ancient Near East? All right, so I'll give you a little overview of geography and chronology, and we'll have to call it a day after that. But over the next few weeks, keep your eye out for some of these different categories and questions. All right, this is a little image of what I might call the ancient Near East. You can see that there is the Mediterranean Sea is basically in the top left. That is the northwest part of your map here. The Mediterranean basin this is the Eastern Mediterranean basin that we're looking at. And you can see that there's a sea coast on the far east of the Mediterranean, when you can see some little cities there: Gaza, Jerusalem, Megiddo, Hatzor, Sidon, Beirut, Byblos. That's what the area that we might call the Levant. Syria, Palestine is another kind of archaeological term for it. I wouldn't call it Israel, because Israel is just a tiny part of this big group, this kind of big group of peoples and towns, but also of this kind of cultural unit that kind of gets along with each other. Another word for it might be Canaan. The Canaanites actually didn't necessarily call themselves Canaanites, by the way. That was a name given to them by other people. It means purple, Canaan. It means that because there was a particular kind of shell, a snail shell, they made purple dye out of. So the Canaanites are the purple people. In any event, that big kind of chunk of territory there, the Levant, that you can see basically in the middle of your screen, slightly to the left of it, is where Israel emerges. They're a small people in the midst of a big world. This entire screen that you can see, this entire map, these folks would have had a cultural continuity between one another. That is, they would have understood the kinds of speech and writing and religious practices and ideas that basically everyone else in this map would have had in the ancient world. So there's Israel. Israel comes about in the middle of a large, thick, rich cultural soup, almost in the same way that you might say, I don't know, the state of Georgia doesn't exist as an independent cultural entity. It shares a lot with Tennessee and with Florida and with Kentucky and with Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Texas and Alabama. I mean, there's a lot that we have in common. There are also some differences, but I would say that the differences between Georgia and Texas are maybe not as big as they are between Georgia and, say, Antarctica, right? So, in any event, we're talking about a very small kind of cultural difference between the Israelites and especially the folks surrounding them, they might call the Canaanites, but also between the Babylonians, the folks living in Mesopotamia. You can see that part of the world, modern, what we now call Iraq, but Mesopotamia, the southern part of Mesopotamia was where the Sumerians and later Babylonians live, and the northern part, that was where the Assyrians live. You can see Ashur and Nineveh on your map there. And then to the west in Egypt, you can see that there's the Egyptian Empire, which follows the Nile Valley, a rich and illustrious history of Egypt. Would take a lot more time than I have here to lay out. But you can see that Israel is between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and those two major powers actually constrain Israel in many ways, but also provide the cultural network and background that Israel takes for granted. It's the world in which they speak. You can also see that Israel's between Egypt and Mesopotamia, along with a lot of other little states like the Phoenicians and the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Syrians. These folk always get squeezed when Egypt and Mesopotamia try to fight with each other, which happens quite often. Here's another map of the ancient Near East. This is more political map and less a geographic map. But you can see still where Canaan is between Egypt and Mesopotamia. That is Assyria and Babylonian. All right, so in this course you'll hear sometimes and read some things about the ages of humanity. This is a way to measure the development of time through tools, what kind of tools people are using. It's kind of a strange way to measure time, but still different kinds of technology make different kinds of social formations possible, different kinds of politics possible. So that's what we're accounting for here. You hear people talk about the Stone Age, right? From the origins of stone tools up until about the year 3000 BCE. We're not going to talk about the Stone Age, but we will talk about the Bronze Age, at least in the ancient Near East, from the year 3000 until about the year 1200 BCE. By the way, I'm using BCE as before the Christian era, before the Common Era, same thing. Some people get worried about when people don't use BC and AD. Since I work in a field where there are a lot of Jewish scholars and a lot of scholars who are just interested in ancient history and work in this field, I tend to use non-confessional terms when we talk about time. Feel free to use whatever you want, of course, especially in church context. But I find it's helpful to myself to not use confessional language especially when conversing with other scholars. So, in any event, from 3000 BC or BCE to about 1200 BC or BCE, we have the Bronze Age. This is when people in the ancient Near East were using bronze tools primarily. And then we have the Iron Age, about 1200 BCE to 587 BCE. This is, at least for Israel, 587. That's the destruction of Jerusalem. They actually didn't use any new kinds of tools there, but it's actually when we stop using this kind of ages of humanity, measuring humans in terms of their technological abilities, at least for categorizing time. Then we start talking about the kinds of empires that rule. So that after that's the Persian period. And after the Persian period is the Hellenistic era. And after the Hellenistic era is the Roman era, and so on. So we start talking about the major empires after this kinds of tools that they were using. For the purposes of this presentation here, the year 1200 BCE is about when we'll start. So before that, in the Bronze Age, we might put the matriarchs and patriarchs in that time period, but we don't know much about that family other than what the Bible tells us, and it gives us some very sketchy data about where they lived and when and why, and we really don't know much. As a historian or archaeologist, we can't dig up anything about this little family. We wouldn't expect to. They're one little family. Little families didn't leave a whole lot of data or writings behind for us to see who they were and understand them as scholars. But about the year 1200 BC, we have the earliest mention of Israel that's outside the Bible, and that is the Stela of the Pharaoh Merneptah. And you'll read about that in the Michael Coogan book. But for all intents and purposes, Israel begins and emerges really as a people around the year 1200 BCE. And they exist as a nation starting about the year 1000 BCE. That's when David, we date David to around the year 1000 and the conquering of Jerusalem. And then Israel only exists as a nation until 587 BCE. Really, it's Jerusalem and Judah that exist after 587. The northern kingdom of Israel gets destroyed in 721 BC. So you'll come across that in the readings. But just to say, we're focusing on this about 700-year period, at least for most of our time, that we'll be talking about what constitutes ancient Israel, the biblical text, biblical Israel, and so on. So just to give you a basic sense of what's going on right before the biblical narrative really begins, or at least the book of Exodus, which constitutes the beginning of the Israelite people, right? So in any event, this map shows you here what the world looked like to someone who lived in the ancient Near East in about the year 1400 BCE. It's about 200 years before what we might think of as the Exodus. You can see that Egypt dominates the area in which Israel would, at some later date, emerge as a people. At this point, you would say that these are Canaanite folk. Egypt dominated this area culturally, politically, and so on. But right around the year 1200, something amazing happened. But basically, the world fell apart. This is called the Bronze Age collapse, and it's the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. So it's not really just about technology. People didn't just invent iron tools and then there was a whole new world. Instead, what happened was that there was a series of climactic crises that destroyed a lot of the food and food sources and trading partners and so on that people had in the ancient world. And one of the results of this was that the ancient Egyptian empires, the ancient empires of Mesopotamia, the Neo-Assyrians and the Babylonians, the empires of the Hittites, which are in what is now modern-day Turkey. Asia Minor is another word for that piece of territory. And the Greek city-states and so on, they all fall apart. And you can see from this map that there's movement of peoples. As people run out of food, they start to move around. And in fact, the Philistines are one of these groups. They are Greek folk who live on one of the Greek islands, and they get on boats and they go looking for food because they run out of it because of these climactic disruptions to their food sources. And they finally end up landing after being repulsed by both the Hittite empires and the Egyptian empires. They end up landing on a strip of basically uninhabited land that we now today would call the Gaza Strip. And that's how the Philistines end up becoming the neighbors of the Israelites. Because all the major powers of the area fall apart into this power vacuum, it creates a possibility for ancient Israel to emerge as a people. And in the same exact place and time, we have other small nation states emerging in what we call the Levant, that is that area of Canaan. So the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Phoenicians, the Syrians really emerge as nationalities, we might say, city-states and even kingdoms that aren't bothered, at least for a few centuries, by Egypt and by the Mesopotamian powers and by the Hittites in the north. This power vacuum, coincidentally, also is the exact point in time in which the alphabet begins to be used. It was invented 1,000 years before that, but hardly anyone used it. The alphabet gets used for writing down vernacular, that is local languages, really for the first time ever, and recording local religious ideas and practices and histories and so on by these nascent, developing city-states and nationalities of the Levant. It's really amazing. The first time ever that local languages were written down. Before that, hieroglyphics and cuneiform writing down, Mesopotamian languages, those were all imperial languages. And if you wrote anything in the area around Jerusalem, let's say, in the Bronze Age, you would have been writing in Babylonian. But right around the year 1200 BC, we get the emergence of these local states and the emergence of local languages and the emergence of the alphabet as a technology that is finally used. And when you read the Bible, what you're reading is one of these amazing productions. It's the only one in the ancient world that got compiled into a giant book that starts with the history of the entire cosmos. It's a fascinating and amazing thing. It's a beautiful thing, and it's unbelievable that it happened. To me, it's a miracle. That miracle of the Bible is what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. So thanks for being here and for taking part in this class. I look forward to hearing about you and about your interests in the forums.